Factsverse presents 33 rare Titanic sinking photos taken just before and after it happened. The RMS Titanic was on its maiden voyage when tragedy struck. The ship that was deemed unsinkable struck an iceberg April 14, 1912, and sank. There were thousands on board, and only hundreds survived. Here are 33 rare Titanic sinking photos taken just before and after it happened. The Titanic got its name due to its size. It is the biggest passenger vessel in the world. It is 882 feet long, 175 feet high, and it weighed 46,328 tons. There were 2,224 people on board when the Titanic sank. Only 710 survived. It could have been even worse since the maximum capacity was 3,327. They just didn't sell all the tickets for their maiden voyage. Most of the people who died on the Titanic were third-class passengers. Their quarters were at the bottom of the ship, which was the first section of the ship to be flooded. The gates were locked to keep third-class passengers in their part of the ship, and in the chaos, the doors were not unlocked. That left many of those passengers trapped. The cost of tickets to be on the Titanic were very expensive, even based on today's standards. First-class tickets cost between $30 to $4,350. Second-class tickets cost between $12 and $60, and third-class tickets were between $8 and $40. 14 years before the Titanic sank, Morgan Robertson wrote a novel called The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility. In the book, the largest ship in the world sank. The measurements were identical to the Titanic, and they were both going the same speed during the collision. They both sank in April. They both struck an iceberg on the starboard side. Both ships didn't have lifeboats enough for everyone. Some people believe the man was clairvoyant, but he claims to have extensive knowledge of sailing. The RMS in the ship's name means Royal Mail Ship. There were 908 crew members on board, and a higher number of crew members died than second- and third-class men. Most were in the boiler rooms that flooded on impact. Many died trying to save passengers, and all 5 postmen died trying to save the mail. Many men knew that they would not make it since women and children were put in the lifeboats first. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, was worth $85 million. He told his wife he'd be fine and he would see her in the morning. He knew, however, that he would be dying. Many famous people purchased tickets but never got onto the ship. These include Milton Hershey, Guglielmo Marconi, and J.P. Morgan. Had these men got onto the boat, the 20th century would look a lot different. The Titanic required 600 tons of coal each day to power the engines. The employees were called firemen, and they shoveled the coal into the furnaces. The ship had 4 stacks, and the engines ventilated the smoke through the funnels. When the boiler room flooded, the men worried that the cold water would hit the warm steam, causing an explosion. So to prevent this, they had to vent the steam as quickly as possible. Of the 421 stewards on the ship, only 60 survived, and 48 of them were women. Here's a photo of steward Thomas Whitley, who broke his leg when he was hit by a falling piece of debris while getting onto a lifeboat. A stewardess named Violet Jessup was on the RMS Olympic when it collided with a warship the year before. She survived the Titanic and the sinking of the Britannica 4 years later. She became known as Miss Unsinkable. The night of the sinking, Captain Edward Smith retired for the evening. This left First Officer William McMaster Murdoch in charge. When he heard about the iceberg, he was the one to order the engines to be stopped. The iceberg was spotted by Frederick Fleet just a minute before the collision. He survived but dealt with a life of depression due to the tragedy. He ended up hanging himself in January of 1965. Captain Edward J. Smith had a long and successful career with White Star Line. He was planning to retire when the Titanic reached New York City. Several ships reported field and pack ice to the Titanic. Because the radio operators, though, were so busy dealing with the backlog of passenger messages, only 2 of the 6 messages ever made it to the bridge. There was a mix-up in the Southampton port and binoculars were not brought on board. Frederick Fleet says that if he had had binoculars, he could have seen the iceberg much earlier. The ship was scheduled to dock in 2 boarding spots in Cherbourg, France and Queenston, Ireland. The Titanic was scheduled to stop in Manhattan, so first-class and second-class passengers could disembark. It was then expected to head to Ellis Island so that third-class passengers could go through immigration. The Titanic was scheduled to leave New York on April 20th, and the tickets for that voyage had already been sold. Ships that had sunk in the past often took 12 hours or more to go down completely. It took the Titanic, however, just 2 hours 40 minutes to go down. Had it sunk like the others, almost everyone on board would likely have survived because the Carpathia arrived on the scene at 4 a.m. The massive ship went down, but the iceberg stayed afloat. This photo was taken the day after the sinking, and you can see the black scuff marks from the ship. Elizabeth Gladys Melvina Dean was just 9 months old when she boarded the ship with her mother, father, and older brother. Her father didn't make it, and the family decided to return to Southampton. Elizabeth was described as the darling of the ship. Elizabeth was the youngest passenger on board and the last surviving passenger. She died in 2009 at the age of 97. There were a couple of food options on board. On B deck, an a la carte restaurant was open for first-class passengers. They could also eat at the regular dining hall. The ship's designers wanted the Titanic to be elegant, so they modeled it after the Ritz Hotel in London. It had a grand staircase, squash courts, a swimming pool, and a gym. First-class passengers could also enjoy reading rooms and smoking rooms. The captain asked the orchestra to play happy tunes while passengers got onto the lifeboats. He thought that it would prevent a panic. In the end, they played hymns for the stranded passengers, and all 8 members of the orchestra went down with the ship. The Titanic had room for 64 lifeboats, but the designers decided to only put 20 on board to provide uninterrupted views of the ocean. Also, the crew was not adequately trained with the lifeboats. Had all 64 boats been on board, and if the crew had been trained correctly, most everyone would have survived. After the sinking, 8 ships were sent to the scene. Many bodies were unidentifiable and received burials at sea. Some were not found for months later. Only 1/3 of the bodies were ever recovered. Experts believe it took only 15 minutes for the ship to hit the ocean floor once it went under the surface. It hit so hard, in fact, it dug large holes into the bottom of the ocean. The impact caused the decks to collapse on each other, packing it deeper into the seabed. Due to the depth of the ocean and the inaccurate coordinates, it took 75 years to find the remains of the Titanic. Robert Ballard found it in 1985. Today, you can buy tickets to see the remains of the Titanic. Deep Ocean Experiences charges $59,000 per person to see the remains. The heir to the Vanderbilt fortune had a ticket to sail on the Titanic, George Washington Vanderbilt II. When his sister-in-law told him about the potential problems of sailing on a ship's maiden voyage, he changed his mind about going. Before changing his mind, he had already sent his luggage and servants onto the ship. One of his servants died. American steel tycoon Henry Clay Frick had a ticket for the Titanic's maiden voyage. When his wife sprained her ankle, he decided they would both stay at home so she could rest. Had she not been injured, they both would likely have drowned. The Titanic's head baker, Charles Joffin, survived by riding the ship down while it sank. He was in the freezing water for 2 hours before a lifeboat rescued him. He was drinking whiskey the entire time, which he believes kept him calm and warm. Subscribe for more.